All right, and I think we are live now. This is Robert Swarwood. I'm here with Ravi Mangla, who is the author of a new book called The Observant. He's also the author of Understudies and a ton of short fiction, some of which has appeared in the Kenyon Review, Cincinnati Review, American Short Fiction, the Paris Review Daily, and he does a lot of other cool stuff, which we're going to talk about in a bit. So, Ravi, I've known you forever. I feels like at least online. I don't know why.
Been a
Time,
while. It's been over a decade.
yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah.
like, definitely over a decade. And I'm mostly, I think, through short fiction. So, before we kind of get into everything else, let's talk about just kind of how you got into the writing process. I know we talked many years ago. I had like a very infrequent podcast that I did, and remember that you were on and we had spoken and we had talked about that too, but just kind of recap, how you got into writing. Because if I remember correctly, like it wasn't like a lot of these authors who go to like MFAs and stuff, like you didn't you never really did that. It was more just kind of talk about how you kind of got into the whole, like what the inspiration was, or just where you kind of got the passion for the writing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I guess I'm more of an if there is outside artist in writing, that's probably closer to what I am. Don't have any formal training in the area, but uh, became a writer just through active reading, reading a lot through my late teens and early 20s, trying my hand at writing, and then began publishing around 21, 22, and doing a lot of short fiction, a lot of flash fiction and short pieces, later on doing more essays. But I think that really cutting my teeth on very short fiction, which is still the way I think about fiction or I approach it, whether I'm working on something much longer, um, thinking about how I'm distilling small moments, is still very much my approach to writing. So kind of stumbled into it and not something that I had always dreamed or thought about doing, but it's been an ongoing passion now for many years.
Yeah, and I will say that you are one of my favorite flash fiction writers. Your story, My Store, is still one of my all-time favorite flash fiction pieces. I don't know why. I actually just before earlier I went back and reread that, and I don't know why. There's just something about that story that's just has always stayed with me. Um,
That's a real throwback one. Yeah.
it was. I mean, that was. I think it was 2008 was when
Okay.
it. I believe was when it was published. I could be wrong. Um, I don't think it's not fair to say that your short fiction, at least, sometimes can be kind of out there, right?
Sure.
I mean, do you kind of feel like, that the flash fiction needs to be grounded in reality or it can be surreal? I mean, because you do kind of go back and forth. And even, we can talk about this novel. I think if I remember, I mean, it's been a long time since I read your first book, but that was kind of grounded in reality too, as opposed to the flash fiction, which is more can be surreal. I mean, some of your stuff obviously is grounded in reality. um do you just, I don't know, like kind of, and it's, you kind of stay within the same, quote unquote genre. It's not like you're writing, horror or science fiction or anything. It's more the quote unquote literary, but you're still kind of, I don't want to say like a George Saunders-esque, but there are some stories that are kind of out there, if that makes sense. You're just
Yeah.
not like writing a kind of a a Jonathan Franzen, couple story or whatever. So I mean, how, like where do these, I guess, and I hate to be so cliche with it, but like the story ideas, like I mean, how do you kind of get that inspiration? You just see something, like even like My Store, like how does something like that kind of come to you and you kind of realize that, what, this is only going to be working as like a 1,200 word story or like a 5,000 word story, or we'll get into the books where you kind of realize, there's much longer, narrative here.
Yeah. Um, I think that in the early going, I was doing a lot more humor, like straight humor and satire writing. And I remember, really wanting to get into McSweeney's and that being like a kind of gold standard. Uh, and I think that's generally the way my brain works is seeing some daily occurrence, something that's pretty normal, and then kind of following it to its most absurd and strange conclusion. Um, but early on was doing, I think, much more satirical work. Definitely George Saunders being a huge influence. I think over time, it's probably the absurd aspects of it maybe much narrower or more, I think I still tend to write pretty out there dialogue sometimes. It tends to be a slightly more broad or absurd, less purely realistic or things that people may actually say. Um, but I don't know if conceptually it's quite as out there as I was doing 10 years ago, maybe sometimes. I think a lot of the stuff I've been writing now in terms of short fiction tends to be super neurotic. I don't know what changed, but probably still absurd and humorous, but I feel like neuroses seems to be a big part of the short fiction I've been writing over the past several years.
Well, and you've also gotten much more political, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. But do you feel that that also has creeped into, your writing or how you? I mean, I guess would you say that you're much more political than, or at least political minded than you were a decade ago? So do you feel that in a way impacts kind of the writing or how the characters interact or how, I mean, has that affected at all with the writing process?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's impacted the process too much. I remember
Well,
after
not
the
yeah, I mean,
first
not the
book.
process so much, but maybe just about how you're approaching or like,
Yeah,
the themes or like what you're hoping to get out of, maybe more of, I don't know, message, I guess, in terms of, the stories.
I mean, I think it's just the osmosis of working in politics and that being such a huge part of my job. I don't know if I'm intentionally going into pieces thinking I want to write a political story, but it feels like it's inundating my world or coloring my world in so many ways that I can't kind of escape it. I'll say, like, Graham Greene, reading probably a lot of Graham Greene novels over the last few years, and how he kind of, in many of them, and I'll use the example of like The Quiet American, which I think is fantastic. And it's the kind of macro of this larger foreign policy and political environment and story, and then the micro of telling also a really intimate and personal story. I like the idea of having things exist within a political world, especially for this new book, while also telling perhaps a more intimate and quieter story within that, the kind of macro and micro interplay. Um, so I think a lot of the stuff that I'm writing is still maybe politics is creeping into it more, probably more and more, but I don't think that I'm going into every piece wanting to make a political statement necessarily.
Um, so yeah, so let's get to the book. But before we do that, let's talk about understudies just briefly. I had to go through my office and I have a shitload of books here. So it took me a while to try to find it because it is a little thin. It's a little thin book
Very
here.
thin book. It's hard to find on a
Um,
bookshelf. Yeah.
and so, okay, so this was your first novel. At what point, and I don't want to spend too much time on, this because we obviously want to talk about the new book, but this was your first novel. This was probably, I mean, even to call it a novel, I don't know, is what, like 30,000 words maybe at the most, or like that.
I mean, these are
So,
novellas, basically. They're novellas, but let's call them
yeah.
novels. Yeah.
So, I mean, do you remember? Because I know this was a while ago again, but do you remember at what point you realized? I don't know, like did it start as like a short story, and you realized, oh, you know
Yeah.
what? There's a lot more here, and then kind of in the same way, is that the same thing that happened with the Observant, where maybe it started out more as a story, or did you know from the beginning that what this? I think this could be at least a long, more than 5,000 words, or however many words, that this was going to be a short novel.
Yeah. I think this and the new one are very different in kind of how they came about. Um, Understudies started as a short story, and I remember it just wasn't totally working. Uh, and I think I sent it to Scott Garson at Wigleaf just for his notes. and thoughts on it. It was probably a 4 or 5 thousand word story. And I remember him saying, "Oh yeah, this might work better as a novel or something longer." And I'm like, okay, I'll I'll give that a try. And probably spent the next 3 months writing it. So it was actually a pretty short writing process relative to, definitely relative to this latest book. Um, so started as a story, was expanded. This one, definitely the intention was writing a novel. And I thought probably going in that it was going to be a much longer novel, and realized that I am not a long distance runner. I am much more of a sprinter or a mid distance runner. Um, so it is. It's very much a shorter novel like Understudies, and I think I really feel comfortable within that kind of word count. That 150 pages is really my sweet spot, at least right now. So this latest one took about 5 years, but uh, the intention was always to write a novel.
And I don't know if you remember this, and I don't even know. So when I pulled this down off the bookshelf, I found there was a napkin in here, which is almost like a hidden fiction piece, although it was like actually 28 words. I don't know if this would, do you remember? And then on the back it says, "For a good time, call 1-800 bouncy castles." Do you remember this at all? Like where this came from or what this was?
I would have not remembered this had I not looked back to figure out how I was promoting the book. Because I was trying to think, oh, I gotta like think about the creative promotion I did the first time around. Because I remember doing some weird things. I looked back and then found the like napkin giveaway. If you order, like the first 10, 15 people will receive custom handwritten napkins. And I think that goes back to writing a ton of my stories early on bar napkins. I tend to not have paper or notebooks around. Or I mean, I have them. I just never remember to bring them with me anywhere. So I'm writing things on the back of receipts, on napkins. Now probably on my phone more, but uh, I thought it would be a cool idea to, yeah, write on bar napkins. So that is very funny that you have one of those.
Yeah, to know now that they're very limited, I feel very special about that. Now, I will say I didn't get anything, or there was no bar napkin or anything in this one, unfortunately. So, you know, it is what it is. But yeah, so this book obviously is much. I mean, again, it's been a long time since I read Understudies, but I just remember that this is much different. It is in a way. I mean, you know, on the back copy it says it calls it almost like a literary thriller, but I know that's usually because publishers try to say everything's a thriller just because it's more marketable. But I mean, really, this is more, you know, quote unquote thriller-esque than Understudies, or really, I would say, you know, I haven't read every single thing you've written, but probably most of the stuff you've written. I mean, there's more, I don't want to say international intrigue, but you know, there's a lot going on here. And in a very, I mean, it's 150 pages and it is a small book. Um, so you said that you knew from the beginning that this was going to be a novel.
Yeah.
Okay.
I knew it
So
was going to be a novel. I wanted to write something that felt more uh, maybe denser, more serious, not be as afraid of the idea of plot. And I think somebody just wrote that this book has no plot. But probably relative to my last book, I think it has a little bit more shape or more of a defined story arc.
yeah, I don't really agree that it doesn't have a plot. I mean, well,
Yeah.
let me ask you this. I know with short fiction, you probably don't, you know, outline like a lot of novelists
Yeah.
would do, but did you have more of an outline with this, or did you kind of or did you maybe know how it was going to end when you started it, or when you started it, it just, which, you know what, can you just kind of talk about like what the book's about real quick for anybody who's
Yeah.
not aware?
Yeah. So, what the book is about is a documentary filmmaker who is shooting a film in an unnamed authoritarian country and then ends up being taken captive uh, in that country and then released under the agreement he make a film about the country's notorious dictator. And this is loosely based on the story of Shin Sang-ok, who was a South Korean filmmaker kidnapped by the North Korean government in the 70s, he and his wife, who was a extremely well-known actress at the time. And then he made 7 or 8 films for the North Korean government as kind of anti-capitalist propaganda before ultimately escaping. So reading about that a long time ago, I think that kernel of an idea or that story has kind of stuck with me as marrying a bunch of my interests as being something that feels political, uh, intensely focused on the idea of propaganda, and I'm really interested in propaganda as an idea, as well as film and just loving film and film art. So it felt like a really intriguing idea and something that was almost stranger than fiction, of how to take that, reimagine it, and provide kind of new context to it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not, there's not a traditional like chapters for, throughout the book. It's essentially, it's almost like little vignettes or little scenes that are stitched together for one long narrative. And it's very interesting. And again, I don't want to give too much away, but certain aspects kind of towards the end where, um, well, again, I don't want to give too much away, but it was almost like, a more traditional thriller would kind of dive more into certain scenes or more quote unquote action, sequences where you kind of just gloss over that. And what's interesting, I feel, is that it's not needed, at least in the context of this book and the kind of the narrative that you've done. We just kind of get, really what's needed, if that makes sense. But the very beginning, what I really liked about it is, and it does, obviously it's not a spoiler because it's like literally the first page, but you have the narrator who is basically he's being taken away from the city. He has a bag over his head. He doesn't really know where he's being taken. But like you don't really start that off with, I have a bag over my head or whatever else. Like you just like the very first line, it took less than an hour for the city noise to be displaced by silence. And it just kind of like eases into, we only find out probably, halfway through the paragraph that, oh, it's more or less like he's been almost like, it seems like he's been abducted at first. It kind of seems like. Now, is that kind of like you knew like the opening was going to be there, or did you have a different type of opening for the book, or?
Yeah, usually I think I build off of a sentence. So I think I like that opening line. Um, I feel like this was something that was more of a concept, as in, I had this story or this idea, um, was thinking about what is that starting point. And I like the idea of throwing people into a very tense scene or a very tense moment. So that opening really starts off probably with more of that thriller element. Um, a guy being abducted and also wanting it to be a little bit disorienting for the reader, as anybody who would be in that situation would be feeling. So I like the idea of throwing people right into the middle of that scene, and them kind of having to feel around a little bit, to kind of get their bearings.
So did you feel, I guess as you were writing it, did you like, this is 150 pages. I don't know how many, words it came out to, but how close was this, or like, early drafts to what was eventually published, or were there a lot of scenes that you ended up kind of realizing, during the editing process that, what this scene, or, I mean, like, how much was there from the beginning to what kind of was there at the end? So like, was this a longer book initially, or maybe first draft it was even shorter and then you had to like add in more stuff to it?
Yeah, it's closer to that version. I think that unlike a lot of people, I'm very envious of people who can write like a huge amount of text and then kind of whittle it down. That has never been my strong suit, or I just feel like I'm always striving to make something longer to meet the actual demands of perhaps a market or readers or what people want. Um, so I think this came in slightly shorter. And then there was a little bit of building it up a little more, figuring out where things felt a bit slack or just moved through too quickly, and then ended up adding a number of scenes. I knew that early on there were like a handful of one thing I didn't know from the beginning. You had asked whether I had it all planned out or whether there was notes or outline written. I'm generally not an outliner, and I would say like the headlight analogy of knowing just a little bit ahead of, I know maybe the next 5 to 10 pages I'm going to write, but generally don't know where I'm going when I'm writing anything, frankly. But I did know that I wanted to do that falcon scene. I think the idea of doing falcon racing in the desert was something that I wanted to get to, even though it's almost like a slight detour from the book, but it feels really essential to it in some way. That was something that I knew I wanted to get in there.
Yeah, and then of course on the cover of the book, we have that. So, was that important to you that that would be part of the cover, or were there other discussions on like what the cover would be? And quite honestly, even the title was this the initial title? Like when you start working on the book, you kind of thought that because sometimes there are working titles, and sometimes titles don't necessarily stay the same.
I did not have a title for this until the end. I think it was saved on my laptop as Project One or something like that. I did not have a name. Wanted to do something around the idea of watching, of viewing, of being slightly removed from the world, but observing things. And I thought The Observant, after probably going through a bunch of different ideas, seemed provocative in that it can be interpreted in probably a handful of ways. And also a word or a form of the word that is not used quite as often. So I don't know, just stuck with me. It felt like I just knew that that felt right to me. In terms of the cover, definitely knew it was always going to be a falcon. Had some friends put together designs, the publisher put together designs, but because I'm a control freak, I ended up doing it myself. So found a old image painting of this falcon under Creative Commons, and just manipulated a bit. And I think it was really perfect that the falcon was masked in this, which is something that happens in falconry as a means of controlling the falcon. So, there's some symbolism in that of a person who has been, even in the initial scene is hooded. And almost in this very unclear situation of being under somebody else's control. So it's very, I would say, pretty direct symbolism with the falcon on the cover. And just felt like, even though it is a maybe 5 to 10 page detour later in the book, one of my favorite pieces of writing that I got to do was, I think, those scenes. So yeah, never really any doubt that it was going to be a falcon.
Well, speaking of symbolism, I mean, you bring up the falcon scene, and that is a little bit later in the book. Again, I don't think it's really giving anything away, but there are a lot of people there. They're bidding on different falcons. And then later at night, the narrator is there, and he basically sees one lone falcon who basically looks like no one has bid on or whatever else. Was there any symbolism in that? Because that felt like there was a little bit something going on there too.
I don't know if there's probably symbolism in it. I don't know if it was quite as direct or embedded, but I like the idea of one falcon that was not purchased, this kind of sad hanger-on that is eventually just loaded into a truck and sent away, and the way that these other falcons are, being bid for tens of thousands of dollars and going to luxury mansions. I enjoy kind of writing about some of the decadence researching the way that various dictators throughout time, all across the world, have engaged in such wild decadence. So getting to bring some of that into the book was kind of fun.
And we mentioned before about how, they mentioned it's kind of like a literary thriller, but it's not necessarily, stick to the, it's not like a James Bond novel or anything like that. But what I did like in kind of the middle of the book, he does watch a movie called A Man Escaped. And then this kind of felt, again, I think I'd asked you before we had started filming if this was almost kind of self-aware about this, where you said, before the film, I didn't know you could make a thriller without actual thrills. He was a master of the slow unspooling of truths, each scene stretched to its breaking point. There was no great revelation or moment of release. Instead, tension was drawn out like a marble dancing along the edge of a table. And honestly, I kind of felt like how that's the entire novel is. I mean, it's a thriller without, there isn't like gun chase, there aren't car chases or like gunfights or anything else, but it's also, it's very tense throughout the entire book. Because even though it is written in first person, you really have no idea what's going to happen to the narrator. I mean, he is in this authoritarian country with this guy who, I know you said the inspiration was, from North Korea, but and then what I also like about this is we never really find out, or if we did, I missed it. You never really say what country this is, correct? Like, you kind of keep it very vague. It's just an authoritarian country. And I mean, I'm assuming that was, keeping the vagueness there was on purpose.
Yeah, I tend to, I mean, in Understudies, the narrator doesn't have a name. I don't think the actress has a name. The two main characters are completely unnamed in that book. So I think I took a major step forward by actually naming a character in this one. But it felt like, someone was asking about research process for this. And I think about, like, I need to do as much research as I can, to the point where I don't want to feel hemmed in by facts, or that I have so much information that I feel trapped within, I don't know, within the knowledge. And I think that I need enough to be able to write the book, but I don't want to be uh, tied to any particular regime, country, period in history. So I like the idea of being able to pull from different places, from different histories, and create a kind of composite. So I think the intention was always to do some kind of composite authoritarian country that bears big resemblance to probably 2 or 3 different countries, but is never named. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it worked out really well. Um, yeah. So let's talk about then, I guess, your political activism, your activism that I feel like, I guess in a way you've always kind of been a little political, but you really got into it last, I don't know, how long have you said? I mean, so do you work as a organizer? I mean, is that like your job?
I work full time in politics, and had a massive, I mean, the last time we talked was many, many years ago. I think at that time I was working in corporate wellness, um, doing client customer support as my full-time work. And then about, I don't know, 2015 maybe, you know, having kind of the populist rise of Bernie Sanders, of having Trump uh, coming up, I think I became deeply politicized in that I was always political, but in a way that I felt like I wanted to get involved. Began volunteering quite a bit, and then that very quickly turned into a job offer. Began organizing in the public school system here, and have been doing, now I do communications and digital organizing work uh, in politics. Um, but yeah, I've been in that career now for 6, 7 years, and I think that is, for a long time, that moved me away from writing. It really slowed down my productivity. I was it takes up a lot of my time doing work around the election cycle specifically. But now I feel like I'm getting to a place where there's more synthesis between this political side of me and the activism work that I do, as well as being a writer. A lot of people that I work with that uh, I've done political work or activism work for years. Had no idea that I wrote or that writing was such a big part of my life, or that I'd put out a book before. Um, so now, for the first time, there's a little bit of a merging of these two worlds, and I'm looking for ways to be able to write more about the political work I did. I finally wrote a flash fiction piece for, I think it was in Saltail a couple of years ago, which was all about canvassing. Political canvassing is kind of an absurd flash fiction piece, but taking on a kind of piece of my job or the work or things that I observe on a daily basis. So that felt kind of like new ground. So I'm interested in delving more into that experience because it's not something that's written about so much, specifically in literary fiction, the world of organizing, of grassroots politics and things like that.
So is there a chance that your third book is going to be about a political organ or activist or something like that?
Could be, no plans yet, but not outside of the realm of possibility.
Well, what about running for office? Is that anything I mean, even like school board or anything like that? Any desire in that?
Much prefer being behind the scenes. I I'm probably not a person who, I don't envy anybody who has to go into office, but I also don't have any aspiration or affinity for it. Just like working behind the scenes.
Um, so what are you working on now, if
Uh,
anything?
so I'm in a post-election moment. I know we had tried to schedule this a little earlier, and was dealing with the June election. In New York, we had a strange court case. People think of it as a blue state, but the Democratic lines were actually struck down for redistricting. So we ended up bringing in a person from Pennsylvania, a Republican from Pennsylvania, to recut all the lines and make a unilateral decision of how the new lines will be for the next 10 years. It's one of the strangest things that somehow in a triple blue state, we ended up with a Republican cutting all of our lines. It's probably going to mean we lose a congressional rep or two. And it also meant that our primaries got split into two separate primaries. So we have a June primary for some seats, and then we're going to have an August primary for some other seats. This means that turnout has been atrocious in that it's going to it impacted turnout for June. It's going to impact it for August. And it means that all of us in political work are in New York State now have to run and be involved with two elections. So right now we are working towards congressional elections in August. And a lot of my work is around press, mass communications like email and whatnot, long form writing. So a lot of my work over the last 10 years has been, I've gotten to do a lot of writing, but a lot of it is ghostwriting. So I end up doing ghostwriting for political figures or different names who are going to be more impactful with their byline.
Any speech writing?
Not as much speech writing as you'd think. Less of that, more op-eds and things like that.
Have you been reading anything recently? Anything good to recommend?
Oof, that's a good question. So I'm reading, it's a surprising one. I'm reading Sula by Toni Morrison because I never read it. So I'm kind of trying to revisit books that I feel like I should have as part of some foundational literary education. But what have I liked recently? I'm actually gonna pull up my notes because for the first year ever, I've actually been taking down every book I've read this year, which is something that I generally never do. Oh, I will say Fernanda Melchor. So discovering Melchor this year has been pretty fantastic. So I read Hurricane Season, um, which is almost like a Rashomon style thriller of a murder in Mexico. It's told from the perspective of various people who may or may not have been involved with it. And then Melchor's latest book, which just came out, Paradise, which is also like deeply violent undertones. It's very dark. So if you do not like a very dark uh, uh, kind of a thriller, but almost more like a very intense drama. Um, I recommend it or I don't recommend it if that is not your cup of tea. But I found these incredibly compelling, uh, beautifully written, real intensity to the writing, um, like interesting morality plays, and uh, just powerful stuff. And I will read anything Melchor puts out after this.
Very, very cool. I can't think of anything else right now off the top of my head. Are there any questions that you wished I would have asked you? If there's anything that you wanted that like you want to talk about, get off your chest?
Anything I want to get off my chest.
And now's the time. You can just go off. That's fine. I'll edit this later. If it's too problematic, I'll just edit it later. It's fine.
I don't know if there's any specific rant or manifesto or anything like that that I want to leave you with. I'd be curious to know, what about yourself? What have you been reading? I mean, obviously you said you were just reading my book about 30 minutes ago, but
it was finish this. And it was funny too, because I know one of the blurbs on the back, I mean, you can probably just read this in one sitting, but it was good to kind of just, pick it up, kind of like read, 10, 15 pages, 20 pages here and there, as opposed to just kind of like breezing right through it, which you could do. But it felt like it was, again, it goes back to that idea of it's a thriller, but it's also a slow thriller, if that makes sense.
I think that's probably the most accurate way of describing it, is like a slow burning thriller. Um, there are, and I think I'm gonna do a reading list for electric literature on thrillers that are not really thrillers. But that's a terrible way to probably market a book, is a slow burning thriller or a thriller that somehow is an anti-thriller. But I will say, The Man Escaped by Robert Bresson, or The Quiet American, the novel, another film, Ghostwriter by Polanski. Those are some that I think of as there's like a tension, a real deep tension and suspense that you feel, but maybe not the traditional elements of a thriller. On paper, it may sound more like a thriller, but when you're actually watching it, it's dragged out a little bit. I think it's a compelling read in that it can move people from one scene to the next, but does not have the traditional elements that you may expect in a thriller. And what you're saying about a one sitting read is interesting. I think that we generally describe any book under a certain length as a one sitting read. Anything that's 150 pages or less as that, but I'm not sure that that's the best way to take in the book. I would say if it was my own preference, and of course people can read it any way they want, but generally having with these real distilled scenes, and I spend a lot of time, I would say, working over the sentences. It probably takes in best, as you were saying, reading it, a handful of sections at a time. I hope I'm not being too precious by saying that, totally fine if people want to breeze through it in an afternoon. I'm thrilled if you read it. But definitely think that there's an experience to be had just by reading it in short bursts.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Because again, I mean, it is even the scenes themselves are more like kind of like, you could have played out a lot of scenes even longer for like several pages, but all we really get are just little flashes here and there. And again, it's, it's more than enough than what it needs to be. You really kind of paint those scenes really well. And again, they get stitched together to just be what it is. And I mean, having just read it, I couldn't imagine reading it as a more, quote unquote, traditional novel, again, with like chapters, and like each chapter is like 5-10 pages long. It just seemed to really just work well that way, especially with how you would incorporate the little flashbacks here and there from his life before he had gotten to the country, and everything else.
Yeah. It's a probably a style of writing that feels true to me, working within those short bursts or those vignettes. I anticipate probably writing more books in that style. So whatever idea I have, I think just gets filtered through that form and style. Uh, and yeah, hopefully it's something that people enjoy reading.
Well, actually, it kind of makes me think about it now. I mean, do you feel that that's also more of just having, written a lot of flash fiction, a lot of short fiction, that your sensibility is more towards those little, flashes of scenes, as opposed to a more, and I hate to say, but more, the traditional kind of just aspect of like, chapter, where, like you said, even with understudies, that started out more as a short story, and then it kind of grown. I mean, now granted, I mean, I didn't remember this, but now having looked at it, I mean, there are chapters here, but literally, I mean, well,
I don't know if they're
there's
quite
literally
chapters.
200 chapters. So, I
Yeah,
mean, we are still getting little kind of like flashes of things there, but at least it's numbered, as opposed to here, it's just, we got a little scene breaks and that's it.
yeah. I think I tried numbering at the beginning. I might have gotten rid of the numbering or the breaking it into different parts. Um, well, somehow I totally lost thread of your question there. What was?
I honestly don't remember what I said either. We were talking about just with whatever else. It doesn't matter. Well, I'm sure it wasn't that important. But for me, I mean, I've been trying to just, you know, uh, like I write more traditional thrillers, so obviously I read a lot of those, but I also try to like branch out with a lot of other stuff. I enjoy literary fiction as well. What I've been trying to do though is read a lot more translated works. So
Yeah,
like
yeah,
books that are from Japan, or from there's a lot of like Swedish crime writers or whatever else. I mean, I haven't read this one yet, but this is one that I saw at the bookstore and I had to pick up, called The Old Woman with the Knife. Which
I think you have to pick up the book if it's called The Old Woman with the Knife.
it's about a story of a 65-year-old female assassin who faces an unexpected threat in the twilight of her career. And I'm like, how can I not get this?
That.
So like really, just a lot of stuff that, I mean, I just kind of felt that obviously there's a lot of stuff that's published in English, but just trying to find these like really great gems from that are translated works. I mean, I've read some that are kind of, they're okay, but other ones have just been like really great, and so I've just I've been really trying to get out there too. In fact, there's another, and again, what's interesting too is a lot of the fiction from other countries, not always, but a lot of them are short. A lot of them might be like 100 pages, 200 pages. Now, I mean, I am reading the Bullet Rain book that's based on the movie coming out that was in Japan, and that's a thick one. But like this one called The Woman in the Purple Skirt, which is like a psychological thriller. It says it's almost like for fans that like Parasite and Rear Window. And again, I haven't read that one yet, but again, just I just
Like,
kind of like finding these books that like I don't know, it's just one of those things I've been trying to kind of get into a little bit more, so I try to mix those up with my other readings. But
well, that relates to me. I've been reading far more work in translation than I ever have at any point in my life, and definitely finding that I'm enjoying the perspective of, you know, what non-American writers may bring to the table and the way that they may approach the work. And as you were saying, the shorter novel, way more accepted, and way more common. I think somebody told me once that understudies that be the best way to build that reader would be to translate it into another language and then translate it back into English. And then it would be seen as a traditional translated work of, 140 pages, rather than United States, where there tends to be about 250 words is or 250 pages is that sweet spot.
Yeah, speaking of translation, well, it's always interesting too when you kind of take into um like, is there anything that's being lost in the translation too? You know,
Yeah,
like
sure.
something that translates, because obviously there are certain writers who write with a certain voice, and that's one of the things too I always kind of wonder as well. Like, I've even had, you know, some of my work translated in other languages, and in the back of my head I'm always, I mean, I've never, you know, I can't read what's been translated, but like I'm always kind of wondering, like, how close is that translation? I'm sure by word it is, but I mean, you know, there are certain things that might be lost in that type of translation. Which, speaking of which, I remember I read this. I don't know if it was earlier this year or last year,
Okay.
where she initially wrote this. Yeah, it was written in Italian and
Oh
translated
my God.
into English by the author. And so I remember having that conversation with a friend of mine where I was like, can you can you write something in another language and then translate it into English? Like, is she, you know, like, I don't know, it's just, it was a very interesting idea of, you know, is anything changing when she's
Yeah.
translating it? You know, like, is it being a direct translation, or when she's translating it from Italian, is, you know, there are things change, you know what I mean? I don't know. It's just a very, I've never read a book that was written in another language and then, I mean, by an author who also speaks English or, like, you know,
Totally.
writes in English, but then, you know, translate it in English. I don't know. It's just, it was, I've never, yeah, that was very interesting.
This is a strange thing. I envy people who can speak multiple languages. There are definitely books and authors that I wish I could read in their original language. Like, I wish I could read the Elena Ferrante novels in Italian, uh, and get a sense of what they feel like in the language. So yeah, it feels strange to only be able to see one side of things like that.
Yeah. So, well, again, thank you so much for hanging out today. This is the new book. Everyone go check it out. You can get it online, directly from the publisher. Um, which did you send this around to other publishers, or was it just sent to this publisher? Or like, how did that come about?
Well, what I'm finding is I think that I write too short for larger publishers. So Spite and Dival came on my radar as a independent press. It's been, they've been publishing for 30 plus years now. I think that's one thing that I look for is a lot of presses, a lot of small, even flash fiction outlets will pop up and then disappear in a few years. So to see publishers or magazines that have kind of an endurance, have been around for years, and seem to be in it for the long haul is definitely uh, something that I look out for. Um, so, I talked with one other author about his experience of working with a publisher. He seemed to have a good experience and was excited that they wanted to publish it. And yeah, that's it's been my experience. It's strange to do it in a pandemic world where you're just contacting everyone through email and don't have a face-to-face interaction with the publishers or the people behind the work. But it's been a good experience.
Great. Well, Ravi, thank you so much for hanging out. Again, congratulations on the book. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I think everyone should go check it out. And yeah, I look forward to another how decade
Give
for
it
book
another
three.
decade.
Is that going to
Yeah.
be?
Maybe not as long this time. We'll see.
Hopefully not. Hopefully not. But whenever it comes out, I'm definitely going to look forward to it. And
I
hopefully,
think I'm gonna have to get tips from you about how to write it a quicker clip.
yeah. But see, you're doing quality over quantity as opposed to me, where I just, you're just churning it out. But I'm hoping that whatever the third book is, I have a little napkin story in it too. So,
I gotta do the napkin stories
which,
again.
speaking
It's
of
a
which, do you remember, like, is this an original, this has never been published anywhere, or like did everybody get the same story? It
not
says
everybody. I know. What does it
the
say?
the other boys in the band were silent on the sofa, stoned or worse. One of them went by the name Cousinart, but I couldn't remember which one.
It's an excerpt from the book. Everybody got an excerpt,
I
if I
probably
recall
would have
correctly.
remembered that. Okay, for some reason, and again, this was a long time ago, so I probably, as I read the book,
It's
would have
sadly
seen
not
that.
an original story.
Okay, well, you know what? I can throw it away then. I guess it's not a big deal. No, I'll hold on to it. But well, then how about that then? Where the bounty? Well, was that in the book too? Bouncy castles. It's been
I
so
don't
long
think
since
that
I
was
did
in
I
the
read
book.
this book.
That you could say is original.
All right, man. It was good seeing you. So, everyone, go check out the book, and thanks again.
Absolutely.